Welcome to State of Ed, a podcast about education inside the classroom and out. My name is Marc.
And I'm Nick Simone.
How you doing, Nick?
I'm doing pretty well. Yourself, Mark?
I'm very well. This is our first podcast. We've been talking about it for a long time, and I'm pretty excited that we actually got this whole thing together. And here we go. So let's have some fun with it. And as people who will listen to this, hopefully there'll be somebody at least listening to it, will realize quickly that we really don't have much of an idea how to do a podcast, but we're going to learn as we go.
Sounds great.
So I know that you wanted to share a little bit about, kind of our goals and objectives with the podcast as we kind of get started here. So why don't you give a little bit of a rundown for us?
Well, when you approached me about the idea and you really focused on the fact that as an administrator yourself and as a teacher, for me, we were constantly talking about problems and issues in education today. I think I just realized that these are conversations that are going on all throughout the nation. There are teachers that are so concerned about the direction that education is taking today. And I thought that even with all of the problems, every day we get into that classroom is a chance to change a student's life. And I think that if we can give some motivation and great ideas and inspiration to teachers, especially young ones who are entering this profession, I think this podcast can be very successful.
I couldn't agree with you more. And what's nice about this podcast, I think, at least I hope, is that we really come at this from different perspectives and similar perspectives at the same time. I mean, we obviously both met as teachers in the classroom, and I've spent the last 10 years or so on the administrative side of things, but still, with my foot in the classroom for the most part, as much as possible, given the administrative responsibilities that I have in the building, but always trying to make sure that I keep that part of me kind of active and stay fresh in terms of methods and in terms of what works in the classroom. And certainly you are at the forefront of a lot of that as well in what you do every day. So I think that we can provide some good perspective and maybe give some people different ideas and reflect a little bit about what's going on in the state of education, which is not only the name of the show, but really what we spend a lot of time talking about in our talks while we commute and back and forth. And hopefully that'll be something that people find interesting.
I couldn't agree more.
All right, so I guess we'll kind of rip the Band-Aid off and jump right into, at least in New York where we are, and we're on Long Island, one of the most controversial things going on right now, especially that we're in assessment season, and that is the opt-out movement. And we have 3 days of English language arts testing that just finished today as we're recording this, and next week we're gearing up for the 3 days of the math assessment. And we have a lot of people in different communities across Long Island and in New York City and elsewhere who are opting out, which I guess growing up and being a part of, public school, we never even thought twice about opting out. We didn't even know that opting out was something that you could do. The test was on a certain date and you showed up and you took it, and that was it. Nobody questioned it. Tests weren't optional, but now all of a sudden things seem to be completely different. So why do you think those things have changed?
Well, the numbers are staggering. I know they've just started to come in, but the articles I've read in Newsday, I just couldn't believe how many students upstate on Long Island, the city, have opted out. There's no question that the movement is originating with politicians trying to connect these test scores to teacher achievement and teacher evaluations. And I think the parents don't want to see their kids being used in that measure. I don't think there's anything wrong with the test itself. As a teacher, my concern is the build up to the test. If you're going to use the test as the primary way to evaluate a teacher, then too many teachers are simply going to teach to the test. So I don't think the actual exam this week is the problem. I think it's the build up to the exam.
Well, just to push back a little bit, I think the test itself is actually a factor because people are sort of rejecting the whole concept of Common Core. And I think maybe if we unpack it a little bit, we could, I think we would probably both agree. It's not so much Common Core that's the problem. It's been the implementation of Common Core and these assessments that have come out of left field that all of a sudden expect students to have this Common Core depth of understanding, and they just unfortunately don't have it across the board. and the numbers really reflect it. I mean, we have across Long Island, you see numbers, schools, districts that were pulling 80, 90% in performance level 3 and 4 are now pulling or 40% in those same performance levels, and that kind of fall off is staggering. And I think a lot of it has to do with the state, frankly, cooking the books. And just to sort of justify what I'm saying there, for the state test, we've been asked, especially in math, with the Common Core Regents exams, to send the results or send the tests up to the state, and they don't even release the scoring materials or the conversion tables until they have seen a sampling of how students have done, and then they're first setting the cut scores and determining what those performance levels and what those region scores are going to be. And if that's not cooking the books, I really don't know what is.
Yeah, but like you said earlier, we've always taken tests. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when we were in school, we took exams, but we didn't have to worry about the build up to the exam. We walked into school one day, our elementary teacher said, take everything out off your desk, here's a pencil, here's a test. And then we went outside and we played kickball, and our parents got the results sometime this summer and gave us indication of how we were doing.
Right, right.
But I really think that the concern is, how can you use these exams? And all your points are very valid, but how can we use these to evaluate teachers? And there's no question that there is a push from politicians, from leaders, to get rid of, or to at least improve, the quality of teaching in the classroom. And I think both of us are in favor of that.
Oh, without a doubt.
I just don't know if this. Well, I'm positive I know this is not the way to do it.
I agree with you 100%. And in particular, I feel like the test is supposed to be there to assess the learning that the student has done. And when you take that and you turn it around and you use it as a tool to measure the effectiveness of the teacher, and especially since Governor Cuomo in his latest budget and his latest legislation wants to make this 50% of the teacher's annual professional performance review, it's almost insanity that we are now looking at assessments in terms of how it's going to impact the teacher versus how it's going to impact the child. And education was always supposed to be, and always is supposed to be, about what's good for the child first and foremost. And everybody else comes in a distant second. But that's not the case anymore. And human nature dictates that that won't be the case, because teachers are going to understandably have to think about self-preservation. And how could you think about self-preservation and what's good for students? Theoretically, they should, of course, perfectly line up, but we don't live in a theoretically perfect world.
It's just, as a teacher, it's just been such a sad week to observe the impact that this has had on everybody in the building. I look at administrators scrambling to find locations for opt-out students to sit and activities to give them. I look at kids whose schedules are completely disrupted. We have the senior high kids who are coming into school late. I know we're a 7 through 12 school, which is a rarity, but it still is a factor. I mean, even middle schools where they have a delayed schedule. And in the end, I say, for what purpose? I looked at my 8th grade class today, and so many of them really don't even understand the purpose of the test. They came out of it and really said, I don't even know why we're doing this for 3 days.
The reading passages have been just endless. They're multiple pages. The kids have to flip back and forth from one page back to the other to look at the question. So it's not even set up in a way that's conducive for, going back to the text and so on. They have to literally be flipping back and forth. It's just, everything about the implementation of this has just been wrong. It could not have been more wrong.
But I can't say that I'm not worried about the message we send to kids as well, because there's nothing wrong with challenging kids. And now so many of them, these are young kids, but so many of them are getting the message that if I don't want to take a test, I don't have to. And that's not a good message to deliver young people either. And as far as the impact that it has on teachers, I look at these elementary teachers with maybe 25 to 30 kids in their class. 3 possible kids get sick that day. These tests are being given to 3rd graders. 3rd graders get sick. They throw up. They're scared about school that day. And now that teacher's entire record can be damaged tremendously. It's such a flawed system, and really has to be addressed. I think it will after these number of opt-outs.
Well, that's an interesting question, because I think the state is doubling down on a lot of this. They're now tying school funding to your participation rate. And I don't think they're going to go quietly. I think that we know that there's been a tremendous mobilization in communities. There's been tremendous mobilization even in teacher unions, administrative unions. There are entire districts and boards of education that have come out, kind of rallying against the Common Core testing, and the state has shown no indication that they're going to back down. As a matter of fact, they're increasing the pressure that they're putting upon the school districts, and they're using the power of the purse strings in order to have that influence. Which, of course, traditionally, politically, is how you always get just about everything done. But in this particular case, they're invested for whatever different reason. There are lots of conspiracy theories out there. Diane Ravitch certainly has been speaking to this a lot the last couple of years. The unhealthy kind of cozy triangle that exists with companies like Pearson and the Gates Foundation, and people who have certain educational agenda and reform that they want to put through, and whether or not that really aligns with what's best for public schools.
You've touched upon so many issues that I'm sure we'll talk about in later podcasts,
Hmm.
such as Common Core and Pearson, and let's be honest, a lot of this has to do with teacher tenure as well.
Hmm.
But I think at the core of this, hopefully, we're going to at least all agree that this is not the way to evaluate teachers. I think we can have an open dialogue, and I think unions are going to have to be understanding that people want some changes to take place, specifically in the tenure laws. But there was a great article I remember I read maybe a year or two ago that they used the analogy of a dentist and his patients. Would you evaluate a dentist? My dentist tells me to floss all the time. I don't do it. It doesn't make her a bad dentist. And teachers, there are many
I should
teachers.
note to anyone who's listening that we're doing this podcast in separate rooms and separate spaces, so I can't verify whether or not the flossing is detrimental to Nick. But moving on.
But it was a great article, and the author just went throughout the whole analogy, and it's the truth. I mean, there are plenty of teachers that are doing a tremendous job, and there may just be some students because they're young. And I'd love to ask all these politicians, did all of you get great grades when you were in high school? Did everybody else study for their exam? Because part of maturity is learning the importance of education.
Well, also, since you touched upon it, let's face it, a lot of these politicians are sending their kids to private schools, and those private schools aren't even taking any of these state tests in many cases. So it's almost an apples and oranges situation. It's a let 'em eat cake kind of moment here, where they're really just showing that they're sort of deaf to the real concerns that exist with the majority of people. I really believe, even if they're not going so far as opting out. It's a topic of conversation there. God knows how many Facebook pages have been set up around the opt out movement, teachers' unions in some of the neighboring districts to where I work. They are using robocalls to get in touch with members of the community and let them know that the teachers don't support the testing, and they're just giving it because they have to, almost like they're being held at gunpoint in order to administer these exams. It's just such an unhealthy place for us to be, and it has ramifications, and it's going to have even greater ramifications as we move forward.
But I just hope all people involved are going to realize that we can't have another year like this, that these issues have to be addressed as quickly as possible. And as somebody that always wanted to be a teacher, I'm so sad to look at the student teachers in my department right now, and they have to witness all of this turmoil and all of this, controversy, because you don't want to turn young people away from the profession. There are great future teachers out there who should understand that it's a wonderful job. It's a great career. I wouldn't pass it up for anything in the world. But we have to overcome this monumental hurdle right now.
So, Nick, one of the things I wanted to also touch upon with this whole testing and Common Core and APPR movement is that there seems to be, in this world of big data, this belief that you can quantify the impact that a teacher has on a student or on a classroom of students by somehow compiling all of this information and putting it through a spreadsheet or some type of algorithm. What are your thoughts about that?
I think there's no question that we're living in a data driven society. and everybody wants to put that into education. It just doesn't work. In addition to my eighth grade class, I also have AP classes, and many of the success stories that I've had with my AP students are kids that did not get a 4 or 5 on the exam. And I think it's the experience that kids learn from being challenged. We can't use all of these, numbers, and, in New York, and we're dealing with SLOs and APPR and all the acronyms, and teachers having to predict how many students are going to get over mastery on the regents. It's foolish. I know at the beginning of the year, when all of this started with the evaluating teachers based on test scores, they asked us to predict how many students would get over mastery on the regents. And my answer was, well, isn't my goal always 100%? Why,
Right.
why would I not? I would never walk into a classroom and say, I hope 60% of you do well. Just like you wouldn't when a kid takes an exam, the goal is to get every question right. It doesn't always happen.
Right. And when LeBron James gets on the court, his expectation is to hit 100% of his shots.
Exactly. So I understand why people outside of the education world want to use these numbers. And, like a lot of teachers, I occasionally read the posts from people on articles in Newsday, and it's discouraging because people think that education is something that it's not. Education is changing kids' lives, and it happens at a different time for every one of them.
When you try to use the same kind of business model that other, industries use, it really there are so many other elements to education. Yeah, I had a dinner with a friend of mine a while back when all this was sort of coming down the pike, and he's in private industry and has been for 20 years. And he kind of had this smug kind of look on his face, and he said, "Well, I guess teachers are really in for it now because they're going to be in a sense rated based on how their kids perform, similar to a business model." And he has two daughters, and I said, "You know what? As a parent, you should be really upset about that because when a teacher's job and their career and their paycheck and the bread they put on the table is going to be determined by these scores, who's going to take a chance on your kids?"
No
Who's going to
question
take a
about it.
chance on them? And his demeanor completely changed because part of education is taking risks with kids. They have to be willing to take risks in the classroom and in the school building and reach for something that they maybe weren't even aware that they could achieve. And teachers have to also have that faith in them. And sometimes you take those risks and they don't pan out, not because of a lack of trying, not because of lack of your dedication, sometimes not because the child lacks dedication, because there's so many other socioeconomic factors that are part of what goes into a school building, that you just can't ignore them and say that you can, figure it out using an algorithm. Just absolutely impossible. And the fact that they want to increase the number or the percentage that this counts towards a teacher's livelihood and ability to retain his or her license. It's just you're begging people to put themselves first and foremost and leave kids in the dust. And that's just not fair.
I agree completely. And I also hope that with this opt out movement gaining such tremendous steam, I hope that, because I am optimistic that we're going to move beyond it, I hope that parents are going to continue to be supportive of the job teachers do. Because we're in this together. It's got to be a joint partnership between parents and teachers to help young people.
Absolutely.
And I've been very pleased with how parents realize that this is not what's good for their students, but for their children. But I hope that they understand that there are times where we have to challenge kids. There are times where we do have to punish kids for not completing assignments, and that there's got to be accountability and
That's right.
consequences.
That's right. Furthermore, just to complete the thought, when you have a situation where you're trying to run a school like a business, then things are going to change. And of course, we all want to do well, and we all want our children to succeed, and we spend unbelievable resources in trying to attain that goal. But there are so many different factors. I think Thomas Friedman, I guess famously said, to make a change like that takes 18 years and 9 months. You don't do it in a day. You don't do it in a school year. But when you really want to change in the direction that a country is going, and granted, we definitely need educational reform. There's no question about it. We have lost our way in many regards. But how you go about doing it has to be smart. And right now, what they're doing, even though somewhat well intentioned, isn't smart. And I don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater, because that isn't bright either. But at the same time, the execution of these ideas and the implementation, as they said when we were going to all these meetings about a year and a half, 2 years ago, when everything was coming down the pike from the state, and they used the analogy of putting together an airplane in midair, which I guess unfortunately sometimes, and these were the state. These were the people who came directly from New York State to teach us about all these changes, and this was the analogy that they used. So it was pretty apt example of the lunacy of what they were trying to accomplish in the method in which they were trying to accomplish
I am surprised it took you that long to get Thomas Friedman mentioned in the podcast.
it.
So.
Well, I didn't want to show my cards too early in the podcast. We can go on and on about the opt out movement, but I'd like to segue into another piece of what I think we're trying to accomplish with this podcast, which is, one, to be topical and talk about different things that we're reading and things that are going on in our classrooms and in our school buildings. And then the other part is something that I think I kind of named the method lab, or the meth lab for short. Is that too inappropriate? But the method lab, which is basically to talk about best practices, talk about things that work in the classroom, things that don't work in the classroom, things that we see that we love, things that we see and read about that we don't necessarily love, things that we hear kids talk about. Just talk about some of the things that we feel are effective instructional practices. So for today, we wanted to talk about, since we were starting up and we were motivated to get this podcast going, we want to talk about the role of motivation in the classroom. So how do you define motivation in your lesson and in the classroom?
Well, to me, every time I start to lesson plan for each lesson, I make sure that I have something in the beginning of the activity that grabs the student's attention. Once they walk into that classroom, I want them to know that there's going to be some exciting learning taking place. And too often when you walk around buildings and you see kids who are sitting down and maybe they're copying something out of the book or copying notes, those first 3 minutes you lose them. And I think it's so important as soon as that bell rings to grab their interest.
Right. And what you're talking about is sort of the difference between a do now and a motivation. I think sometimes in the textbooks and in the method classes in colleges, and sometimes even through administrators and chair people, they are sort of expecting a certain format, like a pat format. You start with an aim on the board, and you start with a do now on the board, and the students come in and they immediately start working on some type of what almost amounts to busy work, just to sort of get the lesson going. And what you're talking about in the motivation is not that at all.
Well, I think a lot of teachers use that because they need that 2 or 3 minutes in the beginning to maybe take attendance, or they want to collect homework. Now we do attendance on the computer. But
Mhm.
I just feel like it sends a message that every minute is not important. And I want kids to know that from the time they walk into my classroom till the time they leave, we're going to take full advantage of every minute in the period.
And to further that, when one of the people that I learned from, maybe learned the most from in my educational career, was one of my earlier principals. I've worked in a number of buildings in the city and out on Long Island, and a man by the name of Saul Bruckner, who I speak very fondly of. Unfortunately, passed away a few years ago, but he was just an educational giant, and he basically taught me about motivating the aim. And I know that this is, some people don't necessarily love this concept, but I really swear by it. It's sort of the same idea. Instead of coming into the classroom and the students see what the teacher has already prescribed as the learning objective of the day, I prefer to motivate that with something interesting. And then you get to the point where you raise a question based on the motivational activity that you've completed. And then that becomes the objective for the day. And of course, I know exactly what it's going to be, just like a magician who knows what card you're going to pull, even though you think you're randomly selecting a card, but he knows it's the seven of hearts because he planted the deck that way. But you don't know that when the trick is starting. And part of good teaching and good anything is the appearance of things happening effortlessly. But in order for things to happen effortlessly, you have to do a tremendous amount of planning ahead of time. So I feel like that motivational activity, like you said, is really the driving force. And from that motivation, just like in a movie, if the first few minutes are good, you'll stick around for the next few minutes because you want to see what happens next. And if you don't motivate the lesson well, then you don't get the buy-in that you need for the next 10 minutes or the next 10 minutes after that. And you can't afford for that to happen in a classroom. You have to keep them interested and enthusiastic from the get-go. And part of that, if you ask me, has to also do with answering the question ahead of time. Why do I need to know this? Because that's the question that every student asks when they walk into the room.
Right.
Because they're genetically programmed to not want to learn or do any of the things that you want them to do, because it's school, and school, unfortunately, is supposed to be uncool, or supposed to be a waste of their time, or they'd rather be doing something else. And you have to prove to them that there's value there. And how do you prove that there's value? You have to attribute meaning to what you're doing, and the motivation is the first thing that will allow them to understand the meaning.
Yeah, I had the exact same experience with two people in my educational upbringing. My cooperating teacher, Roy Douglas from Forest Hills High School, and then my first chairperson, Pat Dwyer, who also happened to be my ninth grade social studies teacher at a different school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, well, she's the one that hired me, and
That's right. That's right.
the two of them just emphasized the importance of the motivation. I mean, they really made me realize just how significant this was, and I feel like I've just built on that throughout my career. I was telling you, even today, with eighth graders who had just come off of the hour and a half last day of the exam, now I'm deciding to teach the Korean War to them. And I just started by asking them some questions about North Korea today, because they're familiar with the controversy with the Sony hacking and the interview. And
Hmm.
hopefully they didn't see the movie, because I didn't want to ask that. They are in eighth grade.
I'm
But
sure they've seen it.
but the questions that they asked from me starting the lesson that way probably made my Korean War lesson today as good as I've ever had in an eighth grade class, because there was curiosity, there was passion to start the lesson, because they're familiar with the current state of North Korea, and then they wanted to know. They're asking me, put up a map, show us some of the conflicts, and what were the problems MacArthur had. I don't think I would have gotten that if I didn't start with the controversy of North Korea today.
100%. You could have started that lesson with a do now activity that could have said, name three things you know about North Korea.
Right.
And, number one, two, and three would have been nothing.
Yeah.
But you start with the interview because that was in pop culture. It's something that's part of their experience. And if you can, and you get into the brain research part of this, of the justification for motivating, you want to attach new learning to something that was already learned, or something that's already been experienced, and then that adds value, that adds meaning, that adds a desire to want to know more. But until you make that connection, and you have to motivate that connection, if you can't make that connection, then the brain is just naturally resistant to whatever it is that you want to talk about, because they don't have any buy-in. There's no buy-in. And
Absolutely.
then there's no meaning, and the lesson will not land the way you want it to land, or have the impact that you want it to have. So start with the interview, and then next thing they want to know is, how do things get to this point?
Absolutely. And they want to know that when I teach the Truman MacArthur controversy, they actually care. There's some context for them to have relevance to North Korea. And
Right.
I really think also, for all teachers, one of our goals should be, we want kids, when they leave the classroom, to still be talking about what has been learned. You want them, instead of going on their phone texting in between periods, you want them looking something up. You want them asking their parents something when they get home. And I think those are always like the best moments for me, when I get messages from parents saying, "Oh, my son comes home and he talks about what you learned in class today." I mean, that's about as good a compliment as I think you can get as a teacher.
That is the ultimate compliment that you can get. And what someone told me earlier on in my career, and one of the, I guess, the parts of the job that you have to just accept, you'll never fully know the impact, positive or negative, that you'll have on a student. And the reason why is because sometimes they don't even know the impact that you've had on them. And if you're lucky, and you've certainly had these moments, as have I, and you've been kind enough to share them with me, when the students reach out to you when they're in college, past college, and so on, and they have those moments, those epiphanies, when they think back to, and they reflect on what helped shape them, and get them to where they are, and they realize that it was moments in your classroom, that sparked interest, and made learning interesting and fun and motivating, and they reach out and they tell you, and those are rare things that humans can kind of get in touch with that and reflect that way. And then, even if they do that, they're willing to reach out and share that. But they do, in those cases, and the ultimate reward for an educator.
You mean the ultimate reward is not a number out of 4 on an assessment test?
It's not a number out of
Oh,
4.
okay. I thought that's
It's
what.
not even a percentile.
It's not even a percentile. Okay.
No, it's not.
So,
It's not. But those are the ultimate rewards for sure. But it all starts with the motivation. It all starts with making it interesting. But one of the reasons why teachers don't do it, by and large, and sort of the excuse that they give is because the interview is not in the curriculum. And the curriculum is too tightly packed and they don't have time. But what they don't see is that they don't have time to not do it because they could teach till they're blue in the face, but there's no meaning. They could say that they taught the lesson and they could put their head on their pillow at night feeling comfortable that they taught the curriculum or covered things, but they haven't really inspired kids. They haven't really taught them in the way that they need to be taught.
absolutely.
All right, Nick, that was a really good conversation on motivation, and we talked about the opt-out movement. And this is my final summary for the podcast, by the way. Very important part of the lesson plan, of course. But I just wanted to let my mother and maybe whoever else is listening to this podcast know that if you wanted to follow us on iTunes, you can find us there in the podcast part of the iTunes store, and you could also find us on the web at stateofedpodcast.com. You can also ask us a question if you'd like at ask@stateofedpodcast.com. We'll also put some links to some of the things that we discussed here in terms of the articles and so on of the opt-out movement and some things on motivation. And you could also follow us on Twitter at SOE Podcast. That's Twitter at SOE Podcast. And so that's a lot of places to find us, don't you think?
I think so. And just like our first few times in the classroom, which would look back on and be embarrassed at, I'm sure down the line we'll look at this and say we've done a much better job in the future.
I'm sure it will be horrifically embarrassing, but I look forward to learning and coming back and having some more really good conversations with you in the future.
Sounds great. I'll see you next week.
Have a good one.